Hey guys, welcome to CraterMania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'd like to welcome all of you back to my 500 movies in 2025 series. For this week, this will be movies number 301 through 305. And so, yeah, as if you're paying attention, I've passed that 300 mark. Um, of the 500 movies in 2025. So I'm definitely over halfway there now. So now with this week, I had originally planned to do a Rocky versus Rambo week, where I was going to be covering both the original Rocky franchise, the first five movies, and all five movies in the Rambo franchise. But unfortunately, I just got a little busy this past week, just with stuff going on with my new job, just stuff at home, a lot of work I had to do around the house and everything. Just a whole like mess of things that that I didn't really have time to watch all the movies that I had planned to. But I do promise that I will eventually come back around to covering the Rambo films here on the channel. Just not sure when because I do have some other things coming up that I have planned to do in this next week and the next couple weeks. So I don't want to kind of like you know mess everything up and go back and have to change things out. So because I do have all of these kind of planned in a very organized schedule and like just kind of themes that kind of play in with like dates on the calendar and just but you'll understand that and later why I'm doing that once I get to those weeks and those movies that I'm talking about. But like I said, I just did have time though. It's better than nothing. It's better than not doing anything at all. But I did have time this week to watch the first five Rocky films. And after this stream, if you watch all this through, you'll probably come to understand that why the Rocky franchise is one of my favorite movie franchises of all time. Um, and I mean, let's go ahead and just jump right into that. And let's get this thing started by talking about the one that started it all. The original Rocky from 1976. There are movies that you watch growing up that end up becoming a part of you. They seep into your soul. Their theme songs become your own personal anthems for like motivation, and their characters just they feel less like fictional creations and more like old friends that you root for with just every fiber of your being. And for me, and I think for millions of fans around the world, one of those movies is the original Rocky. um, and to call it a boxing movie is really just to call the Grand Canyon a hole in the ground or something. It's a profound oversimplification of a film that nearly 50 years later now after its release remains the undisputed heavyweight champion of inspirational movies. It's not just a story about a fight in the ring. It's a story about the fight within all of us. That fight for dignity and for love and just for the chance to prove that we're not just another bum from the neighborhood or whatever. Um, and at its core, Rocky is this gritty, tender, and just deeply human character study set against the backdrop of 1970s Philadelphia. The city itself is really like a character in itself. Um, it's cold and weary and unforgiving, and just we're introduced to Rocky Balboa, who, which is a career defining, and star making performance by Sylvester Stallone, who also wrote the brilliant screenplay for this film. But Rocky Balboa is this man who has, all the makings of a forgotten soul. Um, he's this small time club fighter whose best days are behind him, making ends meet as this low level enforcer for this local loan shark. But Rocky isn't a thug. He has a soft heart. Just refusing to break a man's thumbs. Instead, he offers him advice. He's got this clumsy like charm to him. He tells bad jokes to his turtles, and he's pining for this painfully shy Adrian who works at the local pet shop. Um, and the love story between Rocky and Adrian is the true heart of not just this film, but the entire Rocky franchise, I feel. And it's absolutely my favorite thing about the franchise. And, it's and one of the biggest reasons why I revisit these films time and time again. It's not this kind of typical whirlwind Hollywood romance. It's they have this awkward and quiet and just really it's just a very real romance between Rocky and Adrian. Um, their first date, which is this impromptu trip to this closed ice skating rink, is one of the film's most, I think, beautiful and underrated scenes. As Rocky, runs alongside Adrian, who's very nervous, on the ice. We see these two lonely people, finding solace and strength in one another. She is his why. He's why, he fights, for everything that he lives for is for her. Um, and I love that. Absolutely love that. But just the plot here, is ignited by this stroke of just pure, patriotic showmanship. The undisputed world heavyweight champion, who is the charismatic and brilliant Apollo Creed, played by the late great Carl Weathers. They it he Apollo Creed, he needs this last minute opponent for this fight in Philadelphia, and his opponent has dropped out. And in this kind of brilliant marketing move, he decides to give this local nobody a 1,000,000 to 1 shot at the title. So he plucks Rocky's name from this directory because he likes his nickname, which is the Italian Stallion. And what really begins as this publicity stunt becomes Rocky's chance at redemption. He's chosen not for his skill, but for his story. This opportunity reunites him with his estranged trainer, the grizzled and regret filled Mickey Goldmill, played by the superb Burgess Meredith. You may know him as the Penguin from the '60s Batman series. You may know him from one of the very first episodes of the original Twilight Zone, and many other things. Burgess Meredith is a legend, but Mickey, he initially dismisses Rocky as a bum, before seeing that fire in his eyes. And what follows is not just this, a really cool training montage, but it's just this kind of cinematic symphony of sweat and determination from Rocky. The raw eggs at 4 a.m., the one arm push ups, the punching slabs of meat in a freezer, and of course, the legendary run through the streets of Philadelphia, culminating in that triumphant, ascent of the art museum steps. This sequence isn't about building muscle; it's about building a soul, and the goal isn't even to win the fight. As Rocky confesses to Adrian, his dream is simply to go the distance. Um, and to still be standing, after 15 rounds with what is supposed to be the greatest fighter in the world would prove once for all that he wasn't just a bum from the neighborhood. Um, and the man that was tasked with bringing Stallone's heartfelt script to life was director John G. Avildsen, and There could not have been a more perfect match here. So Avildsen was in many ways, the master of that underdog story. Before he won the Academy Award for Best Director for Rocky, he was known for just these little gritty films titled Joe and another one called Save the Tiger. But but Rocky would define his entire legacy. He possessed a unique talent for capturing that raw and authentic emotion, without sentimentality. His camera doesn't glamorize the city of Philadelphia. It shows you the dirt and the struggle, which makes Rocky's ascent feel much more earned, I feel. So Avildsen's genius was really, in understanding that the fights in the ring were secondary to the fights in these characters' hearts. He would later apply this and that same formula to another cultural phenomenon in the 80s, which is the Karate Kid. And in both films, there's this unlikely protagonist who is guided by a wise mentor, Mickey, and then Mr. Miyagi, to find their self-respect through discipline and perseverance. And Avildsen knew how to make an audience stand up and cheer, not just for a victory, but for that moral and spiritual triumph of his characters. Um, and the impact of the original film of Rocky, on cinema and pop culture is really immeasurable. I mean, it's crazy. It was just a critical and commercial smash hit. It won 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, um, and it catapulted Stallone just to international superstardom. You might as well have strapped a rocket to Sylvester Stallone's back after this film. You know, um, his own Stallone's own underdog story, which is a struggling actor who wrote this script in a matter of days and refused to sell it unless he could star in it, is really just as inspiring as Rocky itself. It's so cinematically, Rocky revolutionized the sports drama. It established a formula that countless films, would emulate over the years. That whole down on their luck hero, the transformative training montage, and that the whole climactic showdown. And Bill Conti's score on this, particularly the anthem "Gonna Fly Now," just really became that universal soundtrack for overcoming adversity. You simply cannot hear those opening trumpet noise, those trumpet notes, without feeling a kind of surge of adrenaline and hope. I mean, seriously, every time I watch these movies in general, just of the Rocky franchise, uh, it builds all this motivation and adrenaline up in me that I could literally run through a fucking wall, I feel like. I mean, that's and I'll get more into that and why I feel that way and what these movies mean to me later on. But culturally, the film's legacy is literally set in stone. The 72 steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art are now universally known as the Rocky Steps. And every day people from all corners of the world make that pilgrimage to Philadelphia to run up those steps, and raise their arms in triumph and just reenacting that iconic moment from the film. The film gave us this kind of modern American folk hero. Rocky Balboa represents that idea that it doesn't matter where you start. What matters is the heart you bring to the fight. And he is that patron saint of every person who has ever felt counted out, overlooked, or, just told that they weren't good enough. And, and I can definitely relate to that. And I think that's why these movies are so important to me. It's just when I'm feeling down and out, I have those feelings of self doubt or whatever. Um, not just this franchise, but just movies in general. I feel like that's why they're so important to me, is because, especially these films, the Rocky films, because they're always there for me when I'm feeling that way, when I'm having those feelings of self doubt. Um, there's always something within these films that gives me that motivation and that confidence to keep going and just do whatever I want to do, anything that I can do anything that I want to do if I put my mind to it. So, uh, I owe a huge amount of gratitude to these films for that. Um, but anyway, this movie, it launched, I think, one of the most beloved and successful film franchises of all time, including one of my absolute personal favorites. You know, and it's evolved. It was evolving with the times, and eventually, given it gave birth to the brilliant Creed series, which respectfully, passed the torch to a new generation while kind of honoring that foundation that Rocky had laid. Um, and to this day, the final moments of Rocky really it gives me chills thinking about it. That whole brutal, bloody 15th round. The final bell, and there's all this chaos in the ring. And Rocky, he has this swollen up face. He doesn't care about the judge's decision. He only screams one name. He screams for Adrian. And you see her. She fights her way through the crowd. And he tells her that he loves her, and she does the same back to him. And then the screen freezes, on their embrace. And it shows that he lost the fight, but he won everything that mattered. He went the distance, for her, for their love for one another, and that like I said, I absolutely love that. And so the movie Rocky is this cinematic miracle. It's a testament to the power of a simple, honest story told with just tremendous heart. It reminds us that victory isn't, you know, always about a title belt or a trophy. It's about, earning your own self-respect and just the love of those who believe in you. It's a timeless, perfect film that will continue, I think, to inspire audiences to to get back up, and fight one more round and just prove that they have what it takes, to go the distance for generations to come. And of all the cinematic heroes, who have graced the silver screen, none have really ever resonated, with that raw, unshakable power of, the human spirit, quite like Rocky Balboa. Um, to me, he's more than just this character. He's this kind of symbol of hope, for every underdog who ever felt counted out. And while the entire saga of the Rocky franchise is this kind of masterclass in storytelling. Um, for me, there's one film that really stands out as the definitive chapter of this franchise. It's kind of this emotional cornerstone, upon which the entire legacy is built, and that's Rocky 2 from 1979. It's not merely a sequel, but just that the very heart of the franchise, I feel. A film that elevates the stakes from this, personal quest for respect to this profound battle for love and family and purpose. And just while the original 1976 film, was this kind of miracle of grit and heart, the follow up with Rocky 2 is, in my eyes, the most complete and emotionally satisfying entry, I think, of all of them. So Rocky 2, it picks up, in the immediate, blood soaked aftermath of this fight between Apollo and Rocky that concluded in the first film. And Rocky has gone, the distance with this undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. the supposedly, the greatest fighter there is. He didn't win the fight, on the scorecards, but he won the respect of the world. And most importantly, he won the heart of Adrian. So the film, explores this question, what happens after that? You know, Rocky, who is now battered and, with the, potentially career ending eye injury, he tries to embrace a normal life. Uh, you know, and so he's kind of flush with his prize money, and he marries Adrian. He buys a new house, new car, just showers all of his loved ones with all these gifts. He promises Adrian that he's finished with fighting. However, the real world, proves to be kind of a tougher opponent than what Apollo Creed was. So Rocky has this lack of education and polish, makes him a a laughing stock in the world of endorsements. And it culminates in this kind of humiliating attempt to they're trying to film this commercial where he can't remember his lines. And he can't even read like the cue cards are very good or anything. So his money starts to dwindle, and he's kind of forced to take this kind of menial job, at the meat packing plant where Polly had once worked. And meanwhile, Apollo Creed, is haunted by the public's perception of their fight. And so he's kind of inundated with hate mail, claiming the match was a fluke, and that he didn't truly win. So his pride as a champion starts to shatter. And he's driven by this kind of need to silence the critics and erase that blemish on his legacy. So he launches this kind of relentless public campaign to taunt Rocky into, he's kind of goading him into this rematch. And so Rocky, he's kind of torn between his promise to Adrian and just that mounting financial pressure. And with that kind of that primal call of the ring kind of echoing in his soul, so Rocky has got to decide if he has one more fight left in him. you know so he's no longer just fighting for himself, though. He's fighting for the future of his new family. And while the entire film is just a brilliant character study, one sequence really elevates Rocky 2 from this great boxing movie to this kind of transcendent love story. And it is this part of the film that really cements its place as my absolute favorite. So, you know, after much turmoil, Rocky agrees to the rematch, but his heart, isn't in the training. He's distracted. His focus is just completely gone. And Mickey is just at his wits' end, screaming at him, to find that eye of the tiger. And the reason for his distraction is Adrian. She has not given him her blessing, and he's terrified that Apollo will just permanently blind him, or even worse. This whole internal conflict comes to a head when this heated argument with Polly and Adrian, it causes Adrian, who is now pregnant, to go into premature labor. And she gives birth to this healthy baby boy, um, which is Rocky Jr. Well, I think his name ends up being it's Robert, but it's Rocky Jr. In this when he's born. But due to complications, Adrian, she slips into this coma. And I think in this moment, the film really stops being about boxing. The championship, the money, the fame, Apollo, it just all kind of stops and goes away for a moment. And all that matters is this quiet, sterile hospital room where, the love of his life is lying motionless. And so Rocky he stops everything. He tells Mickey the fight's off. He's spending every waking moment by Adrian's side, reading to her, or trying his best to read to her. He's holding her hand. He's refusing to leave her side. And so the most powerful scenes for me personally are not in the ring, but just in that kind of hushed quiet, of that hospital chapel. Every night Rocky goes there to pray. He's a man who solves his problems with his fists. He's now brought to his knees in this kind of desperate, silent plea to a higher power. And Mickey, just he's this tough as nails trainer. He agrees to sit with Rocky in solidarity. Not as a coach, but as as a father figure. Kind of sharing in his, um, if you want to call him his adoptive son's pain. So this is my favorite part, of just really the entire Rocky saga because it just perfectly encapsulates who Rocky Balboa is. His loyalty is his superpower. In the first film, Adrian was his rock. She was the shy, quiet woman who stood by him and gave him the strength to believe in himself. And now in Rocky 2, the roles are reversed. He is her rock. Literally, he is returning every ounce of that devotion, proving that his commitment to her is far more important than any championship belt. So he is there for her in her fight, just as she was for him. And then the miracle happens, within this scene. Adrian finally comes out of the coma. She awakens, and they share this tender moment with one another and seeing their son together for the first time and just, understanding the sacrifice that, she has made and the fear that she carries. Rocky makes her this promise that he will give it all up for her. He tells her he won't fight, that he can find another job, and in that moment of that ultimate sacrifice, Adrian gives him back the greatest gift that he could ever receive. And she looks at him, and her voice is weak but firm, and she says, "The only one thing I want you to do for me, that's to win." And that whole emotional catharsis of that single word is breathtaking for me. It is not just a permission from her; it is a command born of love, and it is just her telling him that his dream is her dream, and his fight is her fight, and the film immediately explodes into one of the most iconic training montages in film history. Again, powered by Bill Conti's triumphant score, but this time it's different. Rocky isn't just running through the streets of Philadelphia for himself. He's running for Adrian. He's running for his son. He's running with this purpose that's so pure and powerful that deep in your bones that he cannot lose. And this this sequence is the ultimate definition of just true love and dedication and motivation. And just a crucial element to the success and emotional depth of Rocky 2 is its director, which is Sylvester Stallone himself. After John Avildsen, had masterfully directed the first film to this Best Picture Oscar, Stallone took the reins for the sequel, both writing and directing. And this was a pivotal move for the franchise, ensuring that this film remained intensely personal. Um, Stallone, I think, is of course known as one just the quintessential action stars of the 80s and the 90s. The faces of franchises, not just of Rocky, but of Rambo and, just so many great 80s movies and so forth. And the Rocky franchise is really the biggest reason why I put Sylvester Stallone as a candidate up there with Arnold Schwarzenegger as, my favorite actor of all time. And it's even more impressive that, just aside from the acting that he did in these films, that, he brought the writing and the directing to several of these films as well. So yeah, Sylvester Stallone he's the man. I'm telling you. But anyway, like Stallone has talent as a writer and director is just it's really often overlooked. He was nominated for both Best Actor and Best Original Screenplay for the first Rocky, uh, which is really a feat only achieved by a handful of people in Oscar history. By directing Rocky 2, Stallone was able to infuse the film with his kind of intimate understanding of the character's heart, focusing less on the mechanics of boxing and just more on that emotional turmoil of the man himself. Um, Rocky 2 did more than just continue a story. It solidified a legend. It proved that the success of the first film was was no fluke, and that audiences were deeply invested in these characters. Rocky 2 grossed over $200 million worldwide, becoming one of the highest grossing films of 1979 and just establishing Rocky as this blockbuster franchise. Its legacy is etched in cinematic history. The film's climactic fight, with its famous double knockdown, is one of the most thrilling and dramatic sequences in sports movie history, in my opinion. That raw tension as both of these men struggle to get to their feet before the 10 count is really unforgettable. And just, of course, it gave us one of movies' most famous lines. Not gonna fly now, not Eye of the Tiger, but that purely triumphant, tear-filled cry of victory. Yo, Adrian, I did it. Like that's you hear that quoted in so many things, like throughout pop culture. It's that line is the culmination of everything that he fought for. Not just in the ring, but in life. Um, and just in the grand tapestry, of the Rocky saga, each film offers something unique. The original is that perfect underdog story. Part three is about fame and loss, and redemption. Um, four is this kind of clash of ideologies, but Rocky 2, is that emotional anchor. It's a film that argues that your greatest strength, isn't found in the gym or in your fists, but it's in the people that you love and the promises that you keep. It's a story that reminds us, um, that true victory isn't about a title or a prize purse or whatever. It's about having a reason to fight in the first place. And for Rocky Balboa, that reason was always Adrian. And that is why Rocky 2, with that, it's a profound exploration of love and loyalty and sacrifice, will forever be the champion, of my heart. Um, and but of all the cinematic mountains that a hero can climb, you know, none, like I've said this before, but none feel as personal, as raw or as triumphant as the journey of Rocky Balboa. And for fans like myself, the Rocky saga isn't just a series of boxing movies. It's this multi generational chronicle of the human spirit. While the original 1976 film, rightfully holds its place as a masterpiece, as a this gritty, character driven classic. Um, and while Rocky 2, my favorite of the entire franchise, is that emotional anchor that really built the legacy of Rocky. It's the third installment, Rocky 3 from 1982, that for me truly solidifies the legend of the character of Rocky within his boxing career and his life, and just what his legacy would become. You know, it's it's the film where the underdog becomes a king, loses his crown, and has to fight his way back from the abyss, not for a title, but just for his very soul. It's a emotionally devastating and ultimately uplifting spectacle that perfectly captures that energy of the 1980s while never losing the heart that made us fall in love, with Rocky Balboa in the first place. And Rocky 3 picks up where Rocky 2 left off, with Rocky as the heavyweight champion of the world. But this is a new Rocky. He's no longer that mumbling, down on his luck guy from South Philly. Now he's this polished, wealthy, universally beloved celebrity. The film opens with that masterful montage, set to Survivor's iconic anthem, Eye of the Tiger. And it showcases Rocky's, 10 successful title defenses. Um, he's on magazine covers, he's doing commercials, he's even a guest on the Muppet Show, which is awesome because you follow the channel very much and you hear me talk about the Muppets. You know how much I love the Muppets. But Rocky, he has become, as his new nemesis puts it, civilized. Um, and this kind of comfortable existence is shattered, by this new rival, this new nemesis, with the arrival of Clubber Lang, played with the terrifying intensity by the one and only Mr. T. I pity the fool. That's a terrible Mr. T impression, but Clubber Lang, he isn't this complex character. He's a force of nature, basically. He is just pure, unfiltered hunger and rage, and he just represents the poverty and the desperation that Rocky himself once embodied. Um, while Rocky is posing for photos at his own statue unveiling, Clubber's in the crowds, and he's just seething, waiting for his shot. He publicly humiliates Rocky, calling him a paper champion. You're a paper champion. Or whatever he said, and just in this move that it crosses all the lines, makes this vulgar comment to Adrian, and that's what really sets Rocky off. So now the fight is on, but Rocky is unprepared for this storm that is coming. Um, and the central conflict is both external and internal. So externally, Clubber is this physical monster, unlike anyone that Rocky has ever faced. Internally, Rocky's world is rocked by this kind of devastating revelation from his manager, and father figure, Mickey, when he confesses that he has handpicked all of Rocky's past opponents since becoming champion, just protecting him from the real killers like Clubber Lang, because he didn't want to see his boy get hurt, after just everything that he'd accomplished. So this revelation really cuts Rocky, to the core, planting this kind of seed of doubt in his mind. Was this championship reign all a lie? So, he becomes distracted by this and also by this kind of catastrophic event backstage right before the fight. A terrified and just unfocused Rocky is brutally knocked out by Clubber in just 2 rounds. And he loses his title and his confidence. And, in the most tragic way imaginable, he loses his mentor. And the rest of the film is Rocky's quest to reclaim not just the belt, but that eye of the tiger that he lost amidst that comfort of fame, and in the process he finds this kind of unlikely ally in his former arch rival Apollo Creed. And there are moments, in cinema, going back to what the whole situation with Mick in this film, there's moments in cinema that just are so perfectly executed and just so emotionally shattering that they kind of stay with you forever. And for me, and I think for millions of other Rocky fans, the death of Mickey is definitely one of those moments. It's without a doubt the most heartbreaking scene, not just in this particular film, but I think it's the most heartbreaking scene in the entire franchise. That the build up is what makes it so powerful, I think. And so, in that chaotic locker room, right before the fight with Clubber Lang, amidst the pushing and the shoving, and Clubber, he shoves Mick violently against this wall, and Mick, he just collapses and he's gasping for air, and he suffers this massive heart attack. And Rocky wants to call off the fight, but Mick is adamant about it. He insists that he goes out there. He said, "You'd be crazy if you call off this fight." And what follows, is that, like I said, that brutal defeat for Rocky. But because his mind is elsewhere during that fight. So after the fight, he rushes back to the locker room to find, Mick is fading away. And this performance by Burgess Meredith in this scene is an absolute masterclass. The labored breathing, the pained expressions, just his desperate need to know the outcome of the fight. It all feels painfully real. And Sylvester Stallone as Rocky is a wreck in this moment. He's just a broken son trying to hold it together for his dying, you know, father figure. Um, and just that the final exchange of that in that scene is what truly rips my heart out. Mick, barely conscious, he asks, what happened? And Rocky is just holding back a flood of tears, and he lies to him. We won, Mick. We did it. And so he's given his mentor that one last victory, and a peaceful end. Believing that his kid was still on top, and Mick musters this last breath to say, "I love you, kid," and then he's gone. And the camera holds on Rocky's face as he just bursts into tears, alone, this quiet room, and he just lets out this painful yell. Um, and I feel that every single time. And because just a part of Rocky's world has just been completely shattered now. Every single time I watch that scene, I'm a mess in that moment. It's a beautifully written and powerfully acted scene, just about love and loss and just that cruel finality of life. It's the moment that the series grows up. It forces Rocky to stand on his own 2 feet for the first time. And it's impossible to discuss the soul of the Rocky films, without talking about Sylvester Stallone himself. Not only is he the star and the writer, but he also directed, this film as well, like he did Rocky 2, and he would go on to also direct Rocky 4. And the also another film, the Rocky Balboa film, the sixth film in the series, which I'm not talking about tonight, and I'll eventually get around to do that as well because I do love that film as well. But tonight we're just talking about the first 5 films. But anyway, as a director, Stallone, just again, he has that very unique and often underrated style. He possesses this kind of understanding of what makes a story emotionally resonant. He knows how to build a character, how to pace a fight, and really most famously, how to craft this training montage that can make you just want to run through a brick wall. Um, in Rocky 3, his direction, reflects the changing times. That the gritty documentary like drama feel of the first film is replaced with this kind of slicker, faster, more vibrant aesthetic. The editing is quicker, the music is louder, the boxing is more stylized. Stallone directs with just an incredible sense of energy and momentum. He understands that Rocky 3 is a different beast. compared to the previous two films. It's a story about this superhero falling from grace, and it needs that visual punch just to match it. And his work on the final fight in this film, which is a masterful display of the strategy and heart, where Rocky uses Apollo's style to outwit Clubber Lang. And I think that's a testament to his ability to blend brutal action with that clear, compelling storytelling. And the legacy of Rocky Three is really monumental and extends far beyond the film itself. Firstly, it gave the world the Eye of the Tiger, and Stallone, who was unable to secure the rights to Queen's Another One Bites the Dust, he commissioned this new band Survivor to write a theme for it, and the result was one of the greatest motivational anthems of all time. A song that has just become synonymous with training and perseverance and just the spirit of the 1980s. And secondly, it launched Mr. T into superstardom. You know, um, and not to mention Hulk Hogan as well. I forgot to even mention Hulk Hogan as Thunder Lips in this. And this launched him into superstardom, and it helped build into Hulkamania in the world of professional wrestling. But with Mr. T, who was one of the main co-stars in this film, his portrayal of Clubber Lang was just so charismatic and intimidating that it made him this instant cultural icon. His catchphrase, "I pity the fool," it became this global phenomenon, much like how the phrase "Yo, Adrian, I did it," but for the whole "I pity the fool" thing, like that led directly to his role as B.A. Baracus on the A Team, and then he would also go on with Hulk Hogan, to headline the first ever WrestleMania. So yeah, I mean, just there was so many pop culture phenomenons that were built coming out of this film, and Clubber Lang, set the mold for that larger than life Rocky villain that would follow, namely Ivan Drago. But we'll get to that in a little bit. But perhaps Rocky Three's most important contribution to the saga, however, is that transformation of Apollo Creed from a rival to a brother and a friend to Rocky. The second half of the film is just built on this beautiful, evolving friendship between Rocky and Apollo. And Apollo, seeing Rocky broken and lost, you know offers to train him, to help him rediscover that edge. And this leads, I think, to some of the series' most iconic sequences of scenes. The training sessions in that tough, gritty LA gym, to the emotional talks about fear and fire, and of course, that legendary joyous slow motion run on the beach. Um, this relationship between Rocky and Apollo becomes, the emotional core of the franchise. Paying off in that most dramatic way possible in Rocky Four, and echoing through the entire Creed series. So Rocky Three kind of became like the DNA of the modern franchise. Um, and it's just this movie is just a powerhouse of a film. It may not have the awards prestige of the original, but it is one of the most perfect sequels that really kind of understands that necessity of evolution. It brilliantly explores those pitfalls of fame, and the danger of losing one's hunger, for success. It it delivers this kind of formidable and unforgettable villain. A soundtrack that just defined a decade, and this emotional gut punch that still resonates 40 years later. And above all, it's a story about rebirth. It teaches that true strength isn't just about how hard you can hit, but about getting back up after you've been knocked down, and finding help in unexpected places, and just rediscovering that fire within you. And for me, as a huge Rocky fan, this is just a pure, unadulterated shot of cinematic adrenaline with, a massive beating heart and just a crucial chapter in the life, of our greatest champion. Um, but and again, like I said, for those of us who grew up with the Rocky franchise, the Italian Stallion, um, every Rocky film holds a special place. And the original is a masterpiece of character and grit. You know, Rocky 2, absolutely amazing. The emotional anchor of the franchise. Just it has that satisfying continuation of the dream. And Rocky 3 is about, fame and just rediscovering that fire. But Rocky 4 from from 19 what is it? I think Rocky 4 came out in 1985. Okay. So Rocky 4 is just something else entirely. It's a lightning bolt that's, been captured on film. Just that's this kind of cinematic adrenaline shot that just even decades later, gets the blood pumping and that spirit soaring. And it's often dismissed by critics as this kind of simplistic, product of its time, almost like a feature length music video. I've seen some critics say, but who cares about those critics? Fuck them. But for a true Rocky fan, I think that Rocky Four is just one of the most purest distillation of everything that the character stands for, which is heart and determination and just that unwavering belief that the human spirit can overcome any obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it seems. Like I said, this was released in 1985. And this was like during the Cold War. And Rocky Four just finds our hero, Rocky Balboa, living this life of, of peaceful contentment. He's the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. He's happily married to his soulmate, Adrian. He's just enjoying his immense wealth and fame. And the film opens with this kind of quiet, domestic like, feel with, famously featuring Polly's hilarious and bizarre birthday gift, which is this, his own personal robot. Happy birthday, Polly. I always love that. Like it's very bizarre. It's out of nowhere, especially to be put in the Rocky franchise. So, but all this kind of tranquility is shattered by this arrival of a new challenger from the Soviet Union, Ivan Drago. And Drago is not just a boxer; he is a monument. Portrayed with a chilling perfection by Dolph Lundgren. He is this 6'5", 261-pound marvel of just Soviet engineering, a product of steroids, advanced technology, and just this a state-sponsored system designed to create the perfect fighting machine. So he is presented to the world as the future of athletics. Um, a symbol of that Soviet superiority. And his punch is measured at over 2,000 pounds per square inch, which is a scientifically impossible force of nature. Um, and he's a man of few words. He's very stoic and just has this physical perfection about him. Making him that ultimate antithesis to the emotional, all too human Rocky Balboa. Um, and the challenge is initially met not by Rocky, but by his dearest friend, the former champion Apollo Creed. Which leads me to believe at the end of Rocky 3, when Apollo and Rocky have that private rematch in the gym, it leads me to believe, because we don't get to see the outcome of that fight against in the gym, with that private fight. But it leads me to believe that Apollo won that fight. And that's why he got that extra, bounce in his step, and why he was like he felt like he could, go on and challenge this new up and comer Ivan Drago. So that's just a theory on my part. I don't know, but Apollo, he challenges Ivan Drago. He's driven by patriotism and just this kind of this desperate need to prove that he is still, a relevant force in the world of boxing. And so Apollo arranges this exhibition match against Drago in Las Vegas. And what follows is really the catalyst for the entire film of Rocky Four, which is a moment that really kind of forever altered the franchise and set Rocky on this path of vengeance and, ultimately redemption. So the Apollo Drago fight is one of the most brilliant and tragic sequences, not just in this franchise, but just in sports cinema. It's this kind of collision of worlds. Apollo enters the ring with all that pageantry and showmanship that defined his career, accompanied by James Brown performing "Living in America," and I absolutely love that whole sequence of the film. But it's just this kind of celebration of American confidence and that flamboyant individualism. So facing him, is Drago, this very stoic, silent giant who watches this spectacle with just an unnerving coldness. Um, and the fight itself is, just a brutal, one-sided massacre. Paulo's flair is just no match for Drago's kind of raw, systematic power. And as Rocky and his corner man Duke are watching in horror, and Duke is just begging Rocky to throw the towel. Apollo is just relentlessly beaten. Uh, you know, between between rounds, a bloody and battered Apollo is pleading with Rocky, don't stop this fight no matter what. So it's kind of a testament to Apollo's warrior-like spirit. His refusal to be defeated on anyone's terms but his own. And so he's, Rocky is torn between, his promise to his friend and that instinct to save him, and he hesitates to throw in the towel, and that hesitation ends up proving to be fatal because Drago lands this final devastating blow, and Apollo Creed just dies in the center of the ring in front of all of the world to see. Um, and Drago's post fight response is like cold blooded as hell. I mean, it's one of, I think, cinema's most iconic, like cold blooded lines, and that's if he dies, he dies. And this moment is really the heart, of this film. It transforms that narrative from a sports movie into this kind of deeply personal vendetta. And Rocky is consumed by guilt and rage, and there's only one way that he can find peace, and that's by facing the man who killed his friend. And to avenge Apollo, Rocky, he ends up relinquishing the championship title, and he agrees to this unsanctioned, 15-round fight against Drago in Moscow, Russia, on Christmas Day. And this sets up the film's central, visual and thematic contrast. While Drago was training in this sterile, high tech facility, hooked up to computers and injected with all these performance enhancers, Rocky retreats to this Siberian wilderness. And this is where the legend of Rocky Four, the training montage was born. He's chopping down trees, he's pulling this weighted sled through deep snow. He sprints up this treacherous mountain, performs crunches from the rafters of a frozen barn. It is man versus machine, and nature versus technology, raw heart versus cold science. And Vince DiCola's unforgettable score here, particularly the anthem "Hearts on Fire," elevates these scenes from just mere training sequences into a kind of a powerful, visual poem about the triumph and, of the human will. Um, and then the fight between Rocky and Drago, you know, the fight itself is punishing. For the first 2 rounds, Rocky is battered, absorbing the kind of punishment that would have destroyed any other fighter. But in this kind of pivotal moment, he lands a punch that cuts Drago, revealing for the first time that the Soviet giant is not a machine, but a man. And the fight becomes this kind of war of attrition, a test of who has more heart. And I think the most profound moment, however, comes from the crowd. Initially they're hostile, and they're fiercely like nationalistic. The Moscow audience slowly begins to see the truth in Rocky's spirit, and they witness his refusal to quit, his this endless courage, and just by the final rounds, they're chanting his name. And when Rocky finally knocks Drago out, he hasn't just defeated a man, but he has won over the hearts and the minds of this nation who in the beginning were against him. And just his victory speech, after the fight is really the soul of this film. He grabs the microphone. He speaks not of victory or defeat, but of understanding. During this fight, I've seen a lot of changing. He says, and his voice, just raw with emotion. The way you felt about me and the way I felt about you. And here, there were 2 guys killing each other, but I guess that's better than 20 million. And what I'm trying to say is that if I can change and you can change, everybody can change. And it is a simple, perhaps naive message, but delivered with such sincerity by the acting of Sylvester Stallone, it becomes this kind of powerful plea for peace and human connection that would transcend the Cold War politics of that era. Um, but it is impossible to discuss Rocky Four again without crediting its director, writer, and star Sylvester Stallone. By this point, Stallone was not just an actor. He was the architect of 2 of the most iconic characters of the 20th century, Rocky Balboa and John Rambo. And just his directorial style in Rocky Four is just very lean and muscular and just built for maximum impact. He he understands that the power of this story lies not in that nuanced dialogue, but just in visceral imagery and emotional music and that primal conflict. And he crafted this film that is less a traditional narrative and more an emotional epic that's told through montages and just incredible action. And this is very bold. It was a bold, unapologetic style that I think is precisely why the film resonates so deeply within its fans. And just the legacy of Rocky Four is very immense here. And so it was the highest grossing film in the entire franchise, and just a cultural phenomenon of the 1980s. Its training montages have been imitated and parodied for decades, becoming this kind of universally understood symbol for intense preparation. Um, and the soundtrack is arguably the most memorable, probably, of the series. It's just a perfect time capsule, of 80s power rock. Um, but more importantly, the film introduced Ivan Drago, one of the most formidable and enduring antagonists, villains, whatever you want to call it, in movie history. He is the ultimate Rocky opponent, just the unmovable object to Rocky's unstoppable force, the Andre the Giant to Hulk Hogan. Um, just and the events of this film also laid, the narrative groundwork for, the critically acclaimed Creed series, particularly Creed 2, which directly deals with the generational trauma and legacy of the fight between Apollo Creed and Ivan Drago. And this has really given Rocky Four, a renewed significance, proving that its story was not just, a standalone piece of 80s spectacle, but just a foundational pillar of a multi generational saga. Um, Rocky Four may not have that gritty realism, of the original film, but it has something equally valuable, I think, which is, this enormous unconquerable heart. It's a film that operates on pure emotion. It makes you feel the rage of the loss, the burn of punishing training, and that soaring triumph of the underdog. It's a modern myth, a story of a man who travels to the heart, of his enemy's territory, not just to fight, but to connect, and in doing so, reminds us all of our, shared humanity. For fans of Rocky Balboa, it remains, one of those ultimate crowd pleasers of a film. A glorious and just unforgettable testament to the idea that with enough will, anyone can climb their own mountain. So yeah, I gotta give it to Rocky Four. But that brings me to the last film that I want to be talking about for tonight. Um, and let me just get one thing straight. So if you're looking for the glamour of Rocky Four, or the slick cinematic vengeance of Rocky Three, Rocky Five from 1990 is not that movie, and it never tried to be. And for over 3 decades, a lot of people have looked at this film as the black sheep of the Rocky franchise. It's been, derided by critics and even disowned by its creator at times. But I think, for those of us, including myself, who have walked every step of the way with Rocky Balboa, and this franchise, who feel that grit of South Philly, and we understand that Rocky's greatest battles were never for a title. Um, Rocky Five is this kind of this poignant, necessary, and really beautiful, somber finale to the original saga. It's the film that brought our hero home, not just to his old neighborhood, but to himself. And it picks up in that immediate chilling aftermath of his brutal war with Ivan Drago in Moscow. It opens not with triumph but with tragedy. So in the locker room after that fight with Drago, Rocky is trembling. His hands are shaking like uncontrollably, and he cannot stop them. And it's the first sign of this kind of irreparable toll that his boxing career has taken. This isn't a superhero. This is a man that's broken by his own victory. And upon returning to America, his world starts to unravel at this devastating speed. So this crooked accountant has squandered his entire fortune, and worse, a medical diagnosis reveals that he has sustained permanent brain damage, forcing him into this immediate retirement. So he's stripped of his wealth and his health and his championship. So Rocky, um, Adrian, their son Robert, and Polly, they're all forced to move back to this gritty, working class Philadelphia neighborhood where it all began. And the mansions and sports cars are gone, replaced by this just a common house in Philadelphia, and that familiar echo of struggle. And it's here in the ashes of his former life that Rocky, discovers a new purpose. He takes over Mickey's old gym and begins training this hungry, powerful young heavyweight named Tommy the Machine Gun. So Rocky pours, his heart and his knowledge and his spirit into Tommy, seeing in him a chance to live vicariously through him to reclaim a piece of the glory that he's lost. Um, and the central conflict, however, is not in the ring but in the home. So as Rocky is dedicating himself to molding Tommy into a champion, he inadvertently pushes his own son away, time and time again. And so Robert, he feels neglected. And he's bullied at school, and just he's kind of overshadowed by his father's new protege. And this deeply personal, heart wrenching family drama is the true core of the film. Meanwhile, this flamboyant Don King esque promoter named George Washington Duke is, he's poaching Tommy, circling him, just tempting him with the fame and the fortune that Rocky can no longer provide. And ultimately, Tommy is seduced by all of this. Turning his back on Rocky in this cruel public betrayal. And Tommy ends up winning the heavyweight title, but he's derided by the press and the fans as this paper champ who never earned it, forever living in Rocky Balboa's shadow. So, Tommy is goaded by Duke in all this, and he's enraged, and he confronts Rocky outside this local bar, challenging him, not to a sanctioned bout, but to this raw, unsanctioned street fight. And in the end, Rocky is forced to fight one last time, not for a belt, but, for his honor, and his family and just, the soul of his neighborhood. And to truly understand the intent behind Rocky Five, one must look at the man in the director's chair, John G. Avildsen. And if you're paying attention, this isn't just any director. This is the Oscar-winning visionary who brought us the original Rocky. So, after Stallone himself had directed the increasingly, amazing sequels, Avildsen, his return was a deliberate statement. He was brought back to recapture that raw, character-driven, naturalism of the 1976 classic. And Avildsen, who is just the master of the underdog story, um, who also gave us the Karate Kid. He just specializes in stories about heart and mentorship and just finding strength in vulnerability. His direction strips away that MTV style, the montages and those cartoonish villains of the preceding films. Grounding the story in a kind of a reality that feels authentic and lived in, and just the muted colors, the on location shooting in Philadelphia, just in the focus on the intimate, emotional scenes are just all really hallmarks of Avildsen's, attempt to steer the ship back to its kind of humble, heartfelt origins. Um, and the legend of Rocky Five is very complex because its greatest strength is what many have perceived as a weakness, that it deconstructed the myth. And after Rocky Four, turned him into a global symbol who could end the Cold War with a right hook. Rocky Five reminded us that he was first and foremost a man, just a flawed, loving, vulnerable man facing consequences. And the film's most profound impact is just its unflinching look at the price of glory. The brain damage subplot is not this mere plot device. It's a just kind of a terrifyingly real commentary on the sport of boxing. It's the story of these countless fighters whose careers ended not in a blaze of glory, but in the kind of a quiet, irreversible decline. And this vulnerability makes Rocky more heroic than any victory ever could. We see him struggling to connect with his son, and he's fumbling with financial ruin and just facing his own mortality. This is the human drama that made us fall in love with that character in the first place. The father son storyline, featuring Stallone's real life son, Sage Stallone, is devastatingly effective. The pain of a son feeling abandoned by a father lost in the past is a universal thing, and just the raw chemistry between the two Stallones here lends this kind of aching authenticity to their scenes together. Their eventual reconciliation on the steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art at the end is one of the most, I think, emotionally earned moments in the entire franchise, and it's personally, I absolutely love it. Um, but then there's this the infamous street fight between Rocky and Tommy. Critics call this a betrayal of the series' boxing roots, but I think they really missed the point entirely here. So the street fight is that ultimate thematic culmination. It strips away everything: the titles, the money, the robes, the ringside announcers. You know, it's this primal battle for respect. And when Rocky hears Mickey's voice in his head, get up, you son of a bitch, because Mickey loves you. He isn't just fighting Tommy Gunn. He's fighting for every lesson that Mickey taught him. He's fighting for his name, for his son's respect, and just for the very streets that made him. It's the purest fight of his life. And Rocky Five, was intended to be the final chapter, and as such, it is a perfect, cyclical bookend to the saga. The story begins with Rocky as this forgotten B fighter, on the streets of Philly, and it ends with him back on those same streets, having learned that his true legacy isn't a championship belt, but the love of his family and the strength of his character. And the film bravely argues that true victory isn't about standing, triumphant in a ring or whatever. It's just about getting back up when life has knocked you down for the count. And I think for any true Rocky fan, Rocky Five is not a failure. It is an essential contemplative epilogue. It's the film that had the courage to say that the fight is is over, but the heart is forever, and it stripped away, that spectacle to reveal the soul of its champion. You're reminding us that long after the crowds go home and the belts are put away, the only thing that truly matters is having something to fight for. And for that, it remains this very underrated and deeply moving film. And I think it goes without saying that the Rocky franchise is one of my all-time favorite franchises because on a personal, emotional, and relatable level, it just means a lot to me because it's always that, reminder for me to keep fighting through my own personal struggles. Um, and I think that's why I'm such a fan of these films. Um, but before I end this, I'm gonna just go through the chat. I see some people have been posting some comments here in the chat. So my buddy John Grande showing up here. CraterMania is running wild. Rocky is a great franchise. I pretty much love all of them other than Part Five and the Creed films. Well, like I said, I talked, I can understand, but like I just look at Part Five a little bit differently than most people do, I guess. Um, I just, I suggest going back and watching it and looking at it from that perspective that I gave, and see if you feel about it any differently after you watch it the next time around. Um, but but it is what it is. I respect your opinion on that, and anybody else who feels the same way. Um, John also said, Apollo Crews versus Tyson sounds like a damn monster movie. It does. It really does. But but I mean that's the thing about like boxing and wrestling and everything in general like that. Those type of nicknames that are given to sports stars, and it kind of builds them to be these larger than life characters. I love that about those types of things. But and John, you also said fantastic review. I think that was the best review I've ever watched for Rocky. Well done. Thanks, man. I really appreciate that. That means a whole lot to me. Um, and DOJY isn't Rocky just a box? I mean, it is. They are boxing movies. But like I said, there's so much more to them than just that, man. And that's why I love those films so much. Um, John, you say Rocky 2, I think is just as good. It's my favorite of the sequels for sure. Yeah, yeah, it's definitely my favorite of the sequels. But it's overall my favorite Rocky film of all time. Just yeah, absolutely love that movie. My buddy Pop was in here. Good evening, Crater. Hope you're well, buddy. I know you've been crazy. I have, man. But thank you for stopping by. I really appreciate you popping in here. No pun intended, or was it? But yeah, thanks for coming in here, man. Just even just to say hi, I really appreciate that. And then John, you also said Apollo's character is so well written in his mind. He wouldn't prove that he was better unless he scored the knockout. He had it on points, but his own pride cost him the fight. Brilliant psychology. Yeah, absolutely. Apollo is just a really a one of a kind character in just movie history, and just so very appealing, and I think that was one of the biggest things for a lot of Rocky fans is why they continue that, the filmmakers knew that, and they knew that's why they wanted to continue his legacy by creating those Creed films, which I might get around to reviewing those as well here on the channel. But guys, I hope you appreciated, or I hope you liked um, these reviews I've given for the first 5 Rocky films. Had a lot of fun, very emotional, like personal thing for me with these films. Just so they, I just a lot of relatability with them, and I love talking about these with everybody. Love rewatching these this past week. Um, and I just appreciate everybody who stopped by. Either you talked in the chat, or you were just watching. You didn't drop any comments, but you're watching the live stream. And I also just appreciate everyone who is watching this on replay. Please drop me a comment below on what your favorite Rocky film is out of the franchise, and why. Tell me why it's your favorite. What was so what stood out about that particular Rocky film that made you love it so much. And as always, if you like this video, uh, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. That would mean a lot and help me out a lot. Um, if you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button to catch more videos from me like this one. I have some really cool stuff coming up, including this coming Friday. I was going to do this on Thursday, but this Thursday is actually will make 15 years that me and my wife have been together. So we're going to be going out celebrating our anniversary that night. But on Friday, I'm going to be talking about the 4 House films, because this year is the 40th anniversary of the original House. So we're going to be talking about those 4 films, and we're also going to be talking about the Ghoulies movies, the 4 Ghoulies movies. So those I'll be covering all 8 of those movies on this coming Friday. And then next Sunday, I'll be covering 5 of my favorite horror anthology films, including the first 2 Creepshow films. So be sure to check all those out. And as always, click that bell for any future notifications. But with all that said, guys, I'm Crater. This is CraterMania. I love you guys. Have a good night.